This reciprocity is based on a premise of, which I think is a very ecological premise in the end, that throughout my life as a hunter, I take in the animals as food. They give themselves, or they are given to me. There are various situations in which an animal seems, or which an animal does give itself more willingly, and other situations in which people know, we have to work hard to hide ourselves, or to pretend to be an animal, to call a goose, for example. So it's not that people are, of course, naive and think that, the animal gift is just to be taken for granted. But there's a set of relationships that must be maintained for that flow of gifts to continue. And some of that is very practical, and some of it is occurs at a kind of normative, symbolic level. On the practical level, people are very aware that you have to hunt in such a way that the animal's requirements to survive as a population, as a species in your area, are met. And land stewardship is not about managing animals per se, but is about managing one's own activities in such a way that the animal's autonomy and the animals can do their thing, and one of the functions of those animals in the ecology is to provide food for other animals, including humans. And part of the rootedness to place that people feel is that their bodies go back to the land and feed life. I had an interesting, not so many years ago, an interesting exchange with the daughter of an elderly couple who hosted me in one of their winter hunting camps many years ago. But the daughter was on a canoe trip with my family and some of my students and a couple of other Cree people. And we'd camped the night on a portage, and I was taking bags and canoe down to the other end of the portage in the morning to continue downriver. And I came across my son, who at the time was, I think, 9 years old, and he had found a porcupine, young porcupine, at the edge of the water. And he'd become quite intrigued with this porcupine. And the porcupine was frightened of my son and had swum across a very narrow channel onto a rock, and he was sitting on a rock. And then there was 40 meters of river that he would have had to cross to get really to escape. And so the porcupine was in a bit of a quandary. Do I get back to the near shore and risk this kid, or do I swim for it? So I left my son. My son, of course, was enchanted with this creature. He'd never been so close to a porcupine before. And I went back up the trail to get another load of stuff. And I see Dorothy, this Cree friend, her son-in-law is coming down the trail, and he's not carrying anything. So he had, I'm not sure, one of the other kids, I think, had reported that there was a porcupine. So he was going down to kill the porcupine. So when I got up to the top of the hill, I said to Dorothy, there's going to be an upset child if Bajik kills that porcupine. And she said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We know how to deal with that. We'll just explain to him that that's our ancestors coming back to feed us." And it was actually one of the clearest expressions that the most explicit expression I'd ever heard of this notion of cycling of life. And it was kind of interesting in a way because at a certain level it's kind of like cannibalism, because the bodies of your ancestors coming back, you're eating your ancestors. But that's okay because it's been through a transformation. It's not okay to kill a human and eat them on the spot. That's monstrous. But as part of this larger cycle of exchange, it's not only okay, but it's a sacred affirmation of the proper relationship. There are, of course, many other ways in which people think about this reciprocity. One of the very common experiences around human death is that animals that have been close to a hunter during his or her life will show up around the time of death. For example, an elderly lady died a few years ago. She was an important figure in a major coastal goose hunting camp. The women are the kind of masters of ceremonies when the goose feasting period is going on. They're responsible for receiving the geese from the hunters and then distributing them as part of this ritual. And so this lady, when she died, different relatives around the village witnessed different things. One relative saw her in a dream, saw her walking away in the clouds with carrying a goose in each hand. Another relative was working on a plumbing project in the village. He was down in a trench. So he was he was down to about his chest in the trench, and he said a flock of geese came right into the village, which is pretty unusual, but not even more unusual. He said flew so low over me that I could have reached up and grabbed one out of the air. Another instance was the death of a man who had a close relationship with bears, and people were burying him when a bear walked into the village and walked very closely past the people who were grieving this man's loss. And in those circumstances, people interpret that as this is not an opportunity to kill the animal. These are animals that have come to take on the soul or in some sense, take on the essence of the deceased hunter. So that's one zone in which that's another way in which the reciprocity is acknowledged between soul and flesh. And dreaming is another instance that people's stories really brought home to me. Most memorable one to me is a young woman named Frances was telling me about one of her dreams. And she was in a bit of a quandary about this dream, because in her dream she saw her brother being carried into the village with very badly wounded, on a stretcher, bleeding down one side. And she was concerned about the dream because the understanding of the flow of events is such that if a dream is a harbinger of things that are in process, and if you want to shift that process or that unfolding of events, you should tell the dream to a knowledgeable elder. The very act of telling that dream to a knowledgeable elder will shift the event. And Frances decided not to tell this dream because she was aware that a motif in Cree dreaming is that when a hunter is about to kill an important animal, very often the hunter dies in a dream, and then the animal dies in waking reality. So she kept quiet. She didn't tell anybody. And a couple of days later, Fred comes back, the brother, comes back into the village. He's killed 7 caribou, which is a really unusual kill. And it's an uncanny thing that when you become immersed in that relationality, it's not just a figurative, it's not just poetics, it's not just the imagination working through cultural premises at an abstract level. It becomes real. And of course these stories are stories about empirical experience, and people are sometimes quite amazed. Of course they're remarkable. It's not like they're everyday occurrences. But one of my friends, for example, was hunting geese on the coast, and Canada geese are extremely sharp animals. Like, we may not appreciate that in urban settings because they seem so comfortable around humans, but they're not. That same goose that will let you get within, maybe even let you feed them in a park in Montreal, will not get within 200 yards at James Bay, because they're so smart. They understand context. This friend was on the coast with a group of hunters from his immediate household. There was an uncle there. There were a couple of cousins, and in the Cree way of doing goose hunting, it's a very communal. It's the most communal form of hunting, because it has to be highly orchestrated to make the hunting party as invisible as possible on the territory. And there's a boss. They call them, in English it's glossed as the hunting boss. There's a guy who's responsible for coordinating the activities of maybe 12, 15 hunters on a local territory. And if you don't do it well, you end up with the geese disturbed too much. They learn hunters' behaviors. If they're too disturbed, they just move to another territory that's less upsetting for them. And the old man who had that responsibility was not on the hunt because he was sick. He'd become too elderly and too ill to make the trip. And at a certain point, these guys have taken a break from hunting, and they've got their tea fire sort of hidden, a little bit hidden back, and usually you find some cover. because geese can see flames from even in the daylight. And this goose flew right into them, right into their space, landed a few yards away, and just stood there, completely aware of their presence. And so my friend James's uncle said to him, I guess a couple of the young guys were kind of reaching for their shotguns, and the uncle says, "No, this one means something. Leave it alone." And they worked out afterward that it was at that precise hour that back in Sassabee, the old man had died. That's just an example of, there are too many stories that are too much of a coincidence, for this to be, let's just say, dismissed as, symbolic expression or something. And it's very hard in anthropology, it's very hard in the Western intellectual tradition to say these things as though they're real, because one doesn't want to be dismissed as naive or whatever. But when you become immersed, it's not only that you're surrounded by stories that add up to something more than coincidence, but you yourself start to dream. There's something in the air. There's something about that cognitive community or psychic community that you get drawn into. And then you begin experiencing it yourself, and it becomes real. Those have been extraordinarily meaningful for me, just to understand how far out of those circuits of interaction, of interspecies interaction, we are in secular Western modernity, and of course, those of us who spend most of our lives in urban settings have so few opportunities for that kind of daily connection and interaction with other species, with other lives. So how could we know? But if we're paying attention and spend enough time in settings of that kind of interaction, these things begin to occur.